All right. Well, I apologize for not being able to be there in person. Sometimes life happens, and this morning life happened. So we'll do it remotely. And the title of my presentation is This is Only Temporary Unless It Works. And I grew up watching the Red Green Show as a kid, and that was one of his famous lines. And it usually involved using duct tape to patch together something that he was working on Handyman's Corner. So it's not a very good way to run a ranch, to have that mindset, but there are times where it's actually not a bad way to think about things as we're kind of trying new and different methods of running the ranch. And so quite a few of the things in this presentation are things that we looked at as well. This is only temporary unless it works, and thankfully a lot of them did work. So a little bit more about myself. Yeah, my wife Naomi there, and we got 4 kids. We are in north central South Dakota, about an hour and a half straight north of here. I went to SDSU for range science, was in the South Dakota National Guard for 8 years, included a trip to Iraq, and then I graduated in 2006 from SDSU. We got married in 2007, and now we manage my family's ranch, which isn't the original, land that my great-great-grandfather homesteaded on, but we're not far from it. So, 5th generation of my family to be in this area. Primary enterprises, our mission for our ranch is to reflect Christ in how we love people, manage the land, and care for its inhabitants, both wild and domestic. So we take, the idea of stewardship very seriously. It's not something that's ours to do whatever we want with, but it's really it's our turn to manage it, and we want to do the best we can with both the land and the people that are involved. Primary enterprises are cow-calf, replacement heifer development, stock or yearlings. We do custom grazing with sheep during the summer. We do some hay production. And then the crop production, I won't really talk much about that because I'm not terribly involved with that, but we do that on shares with a neighbor, and it's all no-till production with, we try to keep a somewhat diverse crop rotation in there. And, but like I said, I don't have a whole lot to do with that other than grazing it after the harvest is complete. One thing I've kind of come to realize over the past 10 years or so is that with ranching, everything is about logistics. And if you recognize that Running W brand, that's the King Ranch brand. And interestingly, that operation was started by Richard King, who made his living in the shipping business. So there's somebody who understood logistics on a real fundamental level, and I think that might be why the King Ranch turned into what it has become, real innovative and, very well-respected, well-known ranch. And I think it's because they had logistics figured out from day one, but that's just my opinion. Grazing planning really is the foundation of what makes our ranch function. We view the animals as our combines, if you will. They're harvesting the forage that we're producing, and we need to manage our harvesters, in the most efficient and sustainable manner possible. And the way I do that is with spreadsheets such as this one. This makes it all look nice and tidy, everything goes exactly according to plan, and I can plan it all the way out from May 1st until November 31st, and everything is perfect. Well, these sheets change on an almost daily basis sometimes, as we go along through the season. But as tidy as that may look, it ends up looking a lot more like this in reality. It's just it's chaos is what it is a lot of times. But it's it's logistics. It's making the animals be where they need to be, making sure they have something to eat and then something to drink. As Eisenhower said, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So that's really what it comes down to. And like I said, on our place, that's really what is the economic engine, is managing our grazing properly. I mentioned with logistics, it includes having water where the animals are. And I'm going to spend a good chunk of this time talking about what we've learned with water development, because I think it's been the biggest key to being able to stay properly stocked, even in dry years, as well as having our grazing distributed, across the ranch into places that the cattle don't naturally want to go to. And then as well as maintaining performance of those animals, regardless of whether it's, the weather is nice whether it is a wet year or a dry year. The dugout in the background of this picture here it's a spring-fed dugout, so it always has water in it. This is actually a lease pasture, and I took this picture the day we moved the cattle out of there, and I filled up a little disposable water bottle with the water out of that dugout, and I left it on my desk for about 5 years because it was a reminder to me how dirty that water was. I mean, it was not good, and just a reminder to me that I don't want to let this happen again. The water quality for the animals, I think, resulted in some subsequent health issues with the calves that were on the cow at the time, and it was not a good situation. And so our goal really in every pasture is to try to have as fresh a water as possible and never have to water directly out of a pond or a spring if we can at all help it. The lower right-hand picture there is really the most common method that we deliver water on the ranch, is using these big tire tanks. That we use other sorts of tanks as well, but this is by far the most common. Now, we installed our first one, or Dad installed the first one in about 1988, I believe. And at that time, I don't think NRCS even had cost shared any, because he kind of they had to go up the ladder a little ways to get okayed to use that type of a tank. So we've been using them for a long time, and they've been a good solution. We've learned a few things about how to get the most out of them, but and sometimes that learning curve was a little bit steep, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. As I said, we started with that in 1988 at a time when our herd size was, probably about 100 to 150 cows. And we've expanded to where at times we're running over 300 pairs in one group, or in the case of this picture, there's about 550 yearlings. So that's quite a difference in demand on a daily basis for water, and everything is cemented in and buried deep, so it's not really easy to just swap it out with a bigger one. So we've had to figure out different ways of doing that. But I guess I'll explain the tire tank setup a little bit more in this picture here. Looking back at that last slide, you see that wooden box in the foreground there. That's insulated, and that's typical of most of the tanks that we have, because we want to be able to use them in the in the winter or fall, early spring, when there's snow on the ground and overnight temps are freezing. In this case, this tank is not set up for winter use, but it gives us a little better view of what's going on inside that box. You've got a 10-inch riser pipe or PVC pipe coming up in the middle there, and that goes down about 10 feet. And that brings up geothermal heat and brings some warm air into that insulated box like we saw in the last picture. You'll notice it's covered with a piece of scrap metal. That's to prevent raccoons from crawling down and chewing your water line. That's a pretty big problem when that happens, because now you have to get a backhoe and dig underneath that tank as well as the cement skirt around it. And it's kind of a precarious process to do that. Not something that your local excavators can be real excited about doing. So we want to prevent that from happening. So we put that like a grate over the top of it. As I said, we've expanded the herd size, and as a result, especially in July, we need more water at one time to keep up with the animals. In this case, this is fed by a rural water hookup, and so we're limited to 5 gallons a minute coming into the tank. Well, 550 yearlings are going to drink a lot faster than what this can keep up, so we brought in a reservoir on that trailer in the background there. That reservoir is filled with a hydrant and a garden hose, and then has a 2-inch line coming from that reservoir tank into the tire tank. That way, when the cattle come to drink, we can quickly refill the tire tank and keep it topped off so that the cattle always got something to drink. Another thing that I'll mention is the float valve. You see that blue float valve in the foreground. I've come to appreciate different types of float valves for different purposes, and so that one there is called the Apex Extra Flow. I'm not a paid spokesperson, but I've really come to like them because they are a full on, full off valve. So the water level's only got to drop about like a 1/2 inch or 1/4 of an inch for that valve to open up all the way. That makes your recharge rate on these tanks a lot better, because you don't have to have the water level drop, 6 or 8 or 10 inches before you have full flow. So that's a pretty big deal, and that can make a big difference. I found on these tanks. You also notice there's a T there with a garden hose adapter valve thing sticking up. That's one of the ways that we'll fill that reservoir tank, that portable reservoir tank. Rather, if we, like in this case, we didn't have a hydrant next to it, so we can just run a garden hose over to that. A couple other valves that I'll use are these Apex XS valves. Those are not they're not quite as much of a full flow type as those with the blue flow, but they're still pretty good, and they're much better than the brass Bob valve there at the bottom that I got a red X through. We're slowly replacing all of those Bob valves with either the XS or the extra flow valves because of the recharge differences. Hudson valves are another one that I'll use on a temporary tank. Again, water level drops just a little bit, and then you've got full flow, and makes a big difference. We've also sometimes had issues with cattle crawling into the tanks. So we'll use these cages from my good farming neighbors that they have their chemical shuttles that they can't return for one reason or another, and so I get these cages, and we kind of attach them to the fence in the middle there, and problem solved. Okay, so there's instances where we don't have a permanent tire tank installed, and the one thing that's really become very convenient for us is these portable chicken waterers, if you will, from Barber Industries out at Hermosa. And that's that big metal thing in the background there. And it's just like a big chicken waterer. It's got a trough around the outside that everything from a little lamb all the way up to a bull could drink out of. And there's always water in the trough around the outside, as long as there's water in the middle, of course. That's one of the downsides to a tire tank. As the water level drops, your smaller animals aren't going to be able to reach all the way to the bottom. And so this has been a real convenient thing. And as you can see in this last picture here, we use it in some cases as to add capacity at a site where we just have the tire tank. And they can be moved with either with a tractor or with I have a hydraulic bale bed on my pickup, and these I've got a lifting ear, which you can see on the left side, I believe, of that tank. There's a little projection out the side of it. There's one of those on either side, and just grab those with my bale bed, and I can move around wherever I want to, as long as it's empty, of course. So upper left-hand picture there is going back to the that spring-fed dugout. We're trying to keep the cattle out of those dugouts and dams and ponds, and so I'll use electric fence to restrict access in there, but then we need to pump it out of there somehow. We have used some solar some solar pumps. They're okay. They certainly have an application. What we ran into is capacity issues. NRCS guidelines are 3 days worth of storage. Don't cut yourself short on storage. In this case, we had about a half a day's worth of storage, and it kind of turned into a wreck because the cattle would come at the wrong time of day, either early in the morning when the sun wasn't shining, or just at sundown, and the tank never really had a chance to fill back up, and it wasn't good. So, solar can be good, but it has to be matched with the right amount of capacity on the water side. What we switched to since that solar pump is that lower left picture, which is it's an auto start, auto stop trash pump, which hasn't been without its issues at times, but at least I'm not relying on the sun I can always get it going, and I have a backup pump if I need it, if this one quits for some reason. So that's been our the last couple of years. What we've been using more is this gas-powered trash pump to keep the tank full, and that pump will do about 300 gallons a minute. So it doesn't take long, and it's got that tank full. One thing that's really important with all these systems, and you might have noticed this in a couple of the other pictures, is game cameras on the tanks. Monitoring these water sources is really, really important. If you got a stock dam or a dugout, well, you don't have to go out and check it every day because it's not going anywhere. But when we have these, it doesn't matter what kind of tank we have, we've got the potential for either a float to break and now the water's running over, or something happens and the water's not coming in. And so that can turn into a problem real fast. So every herd has got one of these barn owl cameras mounted in a spot where we can see that the tank has got water in it. And these will send a picture to my email as often as I want to. I can either set it up like a motion sensor or just on a schedule, like once, twice, 3 times a day. I'll use it in the wintertime as well to see if I need to go chop ice, see if the cattle were able to break it by themselves or not. So really a very much a worthwhile investment to get those cameras. It costs about, for 5 cameras, taking 2 pictures a day, it's about $20 a month is what the data costs. The cameras are a couple $100, but like I said, well worth it when you consider the time savings of not having to go look at everything every day. All right, so that was kind of the water story. The next thing that we've done a lot of is fencing, and not just replacing old fences, but also doing a lot of cross fencing. And I've become more and more comfortable and pleased with electric fence. Much quicker to install, quite a bit cheaper as well. But there are I think Jim Garish said there's a lot of wrong ways to build an electric fence, and I think that's exactly the case. Don't cut corners on components, and those little yellow insulators. Yeah, don't. I would highly recommend not buying those, and instead, the big picture there is is fiberglass. We'll buy these fiberglass rod posts, either inch or inch and a quarter diameter, and those have saved a whole lot of headaches trying to find where the fence is shorting out. Lower left-hand picture, you can see you really got to mind your P's and Q's when you're working with electric fence, because every little thing could short it out. In this case, probably had an intern pound that second post in. I don't know why it was set up that way, but that wasn't something that I did. But I take pictures of those kind of things to show my help. Like, hey, you got to watch for these kind of things, because they'll kill you. They'll make that fence short out in no time, and that's the other thing with using the T-posts and any kind of insulator. As soon as that insulator fails, which it's going to at some point, now you just turn it into another ground rod. So you have a potential ground rod every 60 feet if you're using T-posts, which doesn't make me sleep well at night. But the fiberglass rod has really, really cut down on maintenance and increased the reliability of these fences. And most of our interior fences are just a single strand. If we're doing high tensile wire like this, or just high tensile electric fence, we're just doing one strand. Sometimes we'll do two, but oftentimes it is just one. And it's a mental barrier for the cows. It's not so much a physical barrier. Once they get trained to it, they really don't bother it. Some of the things that we had always done with barbed wire fence, everything had to be perfectly straight and really tight, and there was a certain way everything had to be done. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Well, with electric fence, there's these little details you got to make sure you got right, but it doesn't have to be as straight, and it doesn't have to be as tight. It's a little bit different mentality, but you still have to pay attention to the details for it to function. If you're thinking, well, I don't know if that'll keep the cows out of, the good stuff on the other side. The picture on the right is some cover crop grazing we did with yearlings, and that was all I used to keep, to move them across that field. Was one single strand of, in this case, it was poly wire, so it wasn't steel wire. It was a temporary fence, and I never had a single one of those animals get out, despite knocking it down. You can see in the picture there, they really knocked it down, and I kind of tried to make them clean up as much as I felt comfortable with. But they never so much as reached across the fence. So it can be, like I said, be very effective. Even in the wintertime, the picture on the left shows a temporary fence post stuck into some cover crop there. Interestingly, even this winter, I've not had to drill a hole yet for any of those step-in posts. I either could step them in, just using my feet, or using like a dead blow hammer and tapping them in from the top. So even in the wintertime, it's still a solution that can be used. You just kind of got to learn how to do it. So fencing, that was fencing in a nutshell. And this is a good segue into another practice that we use, and that's crop aftermath or cover crop grazing. We do quite a bit of that. I'd say from the 15th of October until the 1st of March, I spend very little time with cows on perennial pasture or rangeland. We pretty well have access to either harvested cornfields, like in the picture here, or perhaps some cover crops that we grew following like a winter wheat, or maybe a full season cover crop that we could use. But we do a lot of this, and it's really really important for us to control our costs for wintering these cows. And I'll do this similar there, where we'll break the field down into about 1 week chunks. We'll keep the cattle in one place or one piece for about a week before moving them. And I can pretty well watch for like in the instance of a cornfield like this, I'm visually looking for husks. The quality of grazing, the highest is, of course, the cobs corn that fell on the ground. The second highest or most nutrient dense thing is the husks. Third is the leaves, and fourth is the stalk. If I have cows eating stalks, I'm doing something terribly wrong. I really, once they got the husks cleaned up and it's just kind of leaves that they're eating mostly, then it's time to move them. And because we have so much no-till ground around us, I've not come to a place where I've run out of cornfields to graze. It's always gotten either the snow got too deep, or we started getting some ground thawing, like I said, around the 1st of March. And not the case this year. This year the snow was too deep. But yeah, really, really valuable resource. This, I figure, when we're on corn stalks, it saves me in the neighborhood of $1,000 a day versus feeding hay. At least that's using this winter's prices. So that gives me a little more incentive to go out and build that poly wire fence when it's 0 outside and maybe a little bit of a wind, that's I can pay myself $1,000 a day to do that rather than to start the tractor and just go feed them hay. So it changes how I look at things when I get up in the morning. We do provide some supplement when we're doing the dormant season grazing, whether it's on pasture or on corn stalks. Normally this time, like we're into March and April, of course the grass isn't green yet, so we're trying to keep the cows in good condition for calving, which we started about the 1st of May on that. 2 things that I've used for dormant season supplement is dry distillers grains from, we got a couple of ethanol plants within about an hour and a half of here, or alfalfa hay. They each have their place. I guess I can go either way with them, but we do try to be strategic about even where we feed these supplements. The picture on the left is where I'm taking some dry distillers grain out, and I'm trying to feed it on places where we have a lot of Kentucky bluegrass thatch, overgrowth from the previous year. The cows do a fantastic job of cleaning up the distillers grain. I would say we're probably well under 10% loss on that, and probably closer to 5 because they just clean it all the way up down to the ground. And that between every little spot where they clean it up like that, and then all the hoof traffic around those areas really helps to break up some of that old plant material. So I got to be a little careful where I feed it, but because of the way we manage, it's seldom that I'm really worried about getting it too short. But like I said, I just try to be strategic about where I'm feeding it. Of course, it does come with challenges. The snow does get deep sometimes, and I get stuck more often than I'd like, and of course, it's never close to home. There's years where we can't feed, or that we can't graze, this year being a pretty good example. So I don't always feed my cows hay, but when I do, I'm also feeding soil. So again, being strategic about how and where and what methods we use to feed is a pretty important consideration for me. Growing up, we had the winter pasture where the cows always went there. We always fed hay on the same place, the same time, and the hay yard. We always put the hay in the same place. It was just the same thing. And I mean, there was reasons for that. I'm not saying that was all wrong. Our context has changed greatly since 1995. But one thing I realized was once I got to the after college and moved to the place that I'm at now, one winter I spent the whole winter hauling hay to this pasture and just fighting the snow, and it was so much work. Meanwhile, like literally across the yard, other side of the yard, I had a hay field that probably had 4 inches of snow on the level, and I could have been feeding hay out there the whole time, but I just didn't know any better because I hadn't realized what I was doing. Well, I've been, again, probably overly involved or mentally stressing about where are we feeding this hay, where are the nutrients going, where are they coming from, and what's the residue look like, just all those kind of things that I didn't used to think about a whole lot. One of the methods we do use is bale grazing, as shown in these pictures. Again, we use electric fence to restrict them to about 3 days worth of hay at one time, and try to space the bales far enough apart where the waste isn't too, so that those little dead spots aren't too close together. You can see the picture on the right. That's actually 2 years worth of bale grazing. We alternated rows basically. Yeah, there's a few spots where probably the bales were a little close together, or maybe the hay quality wasn't very good, so they didn't clean it up very well. But overall, it's been a useful tool. I will say I don't do it all the time. You kind of got to go into it with your eyes open because there's going to be locations where you shouldn't do it. For example, native prairie, I don't think responds real well to bale grazing, whereas, like in these cases, this is land that's probably been farmed for 100 years. It's been in hay production for about the last 20, 25 years. And there's some some deficiencies there that the bale grazing is going to help to correct, and it's got the right kind of plant community. That in that picture is intermediate wheatgrass and alfalfa, and that'll handle the heavy residue pretty well. Yeah, there'll be some weeds, and it'll take a couple years for those spots to come back, but when they do, they're very productive. But you know, I wouldn't do this on land that I'm planning to plant wheat into the next year or something. You know, you just got to be careful how you use it, and there's more waste. There's no doubt about that. So your hay prices are going to determine a little bit on the economics of whether this works or not. This year, in my case, I didn't have winter help, so the convenience of being able to just set out all those bales on a nice day and then just move polywire rather than hauling hay out every day. Yeah, the convenience factor was worth it. Yeah, it's a tool to keep in mind as we're thinking about how do we get these cows through the winter, but how do we also feed our soil and be strategic about the nutrients that we're adding to, which nutrients we're adding and where we're adding them. Just a couple minutes about sheep grazing. We started doing this about 4 years ago. Scared me to death the first time. It was in May, and they brought about 900 ewes, and I thought, what am I getting myself into? When those ewes came off the truck, I think that was one of the 5 scariest days of my life as a rancher, because I was really concerned about, was my math right? Do we actually have enough for these sheep to eat? And well, it turned out we did, and this year we'll have 3 bands, so we'll have about 3,000 ewes that we're bringing in. The biggest reason is the picture on the left. We've got quite a bit of leafy spurge in a certain corner of the ranch, and chemical control hadn't been terribly effective, at least when we had been using it. And honestly, we'd always used it pretty reluctantly because we know that we would be doing damage to desirable broadleaf species as well. So we needed to come up with a solution, and our neighbor, I'll say one of the neighbors across the fence is really good at spraying. He's done a really good job of keeping the leafy spurge out of his pasture, but it's come at pretty high financial cost, as well as the environmental cost. I don't know how you put a dollar value on that, because there's obviously some beneficials, like I said, that would have been hurt. So through a mutual acquaintance, I was able to get connected with this family that raises sheep over by Watertown, and they brought us the ewes, and they've worked amazingly well. You can see in the picture there how well they're consuming the leafy spurge, and not necessarily overgrazing the grass either. That's what's really been the most intriguing to me, is how they've been selecting those broadleaf plants. Picture on the right is Western snowberry is across the fence where the guard dog is there. Same thing, it's something that the cows aren't eating as much. Of course, it's not a noxious weed, but we've got some places where it's awfully thick, and it's probably, I would estimate it's a third of the biomass that's on some of our pastures. Well, the sheep can utilize it where the cattle, very reluctantly will use it. So again, the sheep have been a great fit for our plant community. And honestly, if I was probably a little more courageous, we'd probably run 100% sheep, I think, because they're a really good fit for our plant community. And again, I want to just take a step back and say that's going to depend on your context and what your plant community is. If you're dominated by brome grass and bluegrass and not a lot of broadleaves, sheep may or may not be a great fit ecologically, but in our context, they're an excellent fit. So I am really a tinkerer. I hardly ever do the same thing twice, it seems like, and it drives probably my help crazy. I know it drives my wife crazy sometimes, and oftentimes my dad as well. And I realize I need to probably be a little bit more strategic and methodical about making changes and monitoring, the outcomes. This is just a couple of pages from a book called Knowledge Rich Ranching by Alan Nation. Highly, highly recommend that book if you're in the grazing business or anything that is a semblance of ranching. Highly recommend this book. He talks about there's a kind of a sequence of questions that you should think about asking yourselves as you're thinking about making these changes. What's the outcome I need? What's the risk of not making the change? What's the worst that could happen? And am I willing to accept that? And then on the flip side, what's the best that could happen? Am I willing to accept that? And why haven't I done it yet? And why should I do it now? I think these are all really good questions to ask as we're thinking about making changes, and taking the time to stop and just think about it, I believe is a very, very important step in. Don't do something because a guru told you to, or because, this Luke Perman guy talked about why I should use these blue float valves in my tanks. That's a terrible reason. You need to think about it yourself. What am I trying to accomplish here? And then, assemble information from, reputable sources, and don't just do it because the guru said to, which I'm not a guru, by the way, but don't just do things because the guru said that's what you're supposed to do. Aldo Leopold said, a conservationist is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke of the axe, he is writing his signature on the face of the land. The top picture is my daughter, and she loves picking wildflowers. And it's, of course, a lot of fun for me to take her along and see what she comes back with. And and to see the excitement that she has doing it, it's really rewarding. And that's something that puts into perspective, our management. I want her to be able to continue collecting wildflowers, as long as she is able to, and I want the generations after her to be able to do the same thing. So how I manage today is going to affect that going forward, and that's important to me. The bottom picture is my dad, and Lyle Perman, and he's the one that raised me into this way of thinking. And his favorite quote is another Aldo Leopold one, and that is that the landscape of any farm is an owner's portrait of himself. And so, again, that's been his kind of way of looking at it, is that this is not just a way for our family to earn a living, but it's our legacy that we pass along, and it's an expression of our values. The way we manage is an expression of our values. So that's how we try to think about each of these decisions on managing the ranch. And so I'll just leave you with the question: what do you want your portrait to look like? What do you want your signature on the land to resemble? And I guess that's what we're aiming for. And I guess I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody's got them. I guess I will follow up with one thing and say we have, especially with the fence and water development, we've done a lot of cost share programs on either with NRCS or U.S. Fish and Wildlife or South Dakota Game and Fish and Parks. There's a lot of resources out there on to help design the systems and then to help with the cost side of it. And honestly, there is not a better investment in a ranch than those water and fence. There just isn't. I think that far surpasses genetics, or I'll go even so far to say marketing. In the long-term viability of your business is to have a healthy resource to be producing off of. So really, really want to encourage, if any of this stuff is kind of, you're thinking maybe I should think about doing this, talk to your resource people, and they'll be able to get you some help. So.
What questions do we have? What did you have to do as far as changing your fencing once you brought the sheep in? What do you have for boundary fence? What do you use now with bringing the sheep in? Did you hear the question okay?
Yep, I did. So there's about 5 different paradigms I had about sheep and excuses why I thought we could never have them, and fence was one of them. And what you see in the picture there is all they use for fence: 2 strands of polywire. The sheep are trained to it, of course, but They build a new paddock every day for the sheep. And so I'll take a step back. They what they do is they take them to water, which you saw a picture of the water back here. So they have about half an acre fenced around the water source, and they'll bring them there at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and they'll leave them there until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they'll take them to a new paddock that they built, and so they'll be on a 2 to 2.5 acres of pasture until the next morning at 11 o'clock, and then they'll take them back to water. Well, in the meantime, the shepherds are building the paddock for the next day, and they're just leapfrogging their fences. And you can see that in this picture on the left. Each of those rectangles was one day, and you can see the progression, where they started on the left side, kind of in the background, and worked their way towards the bottom of your screen, and then jumped over to the right side and worked their way to the back again. So yeah, we have not done any permanent fencing at all, other than in the corrals. We added some lower panels so that they can easily ship or do any processing in the yard. But as far as pasture fences, we've done nothing. They just done temporary electric fence for all of it.
Okay, so I have a question on the sheep too. Do you have the sheep year round or just in the summer?
No, they come about the 15th of May, and they'll go home around the 1st of November.
What do you do with your guardian dog in the off season? Does it return with the sheep?
They stay with the sheep. We don't have any here over the winter. So the dogs have done a good job. I don't think we've lost any sheep to predators, at least not that we're aware of, which is significant in 3 years, and that's a lot of sheep over that amount of time. However, the dogs do pose some problems, especially when the sheep come to the yard. Dad's got some chickens that he lets run around the yard, and he has to lock the chickens up, or the dogs have to get locked up, and sometimes that's an issue. So they used the donkeys on one group last year, and that worked pretty well. We'll probably do that again.
Do you completely keep your livestock away from the dams and dugouts completely, or is it like maybe in the heat of the summer you allow them to get in there to cool off, or?
The only time that I would let them into those is if I'm, for one reason or another. I'll say if they're pairs, I almost never let them into standing water if I can at all help it. Now there's places where we have there's 30 acres of springs, and there's a lot of forage in there. Well, then I won't restrict them necessarily, but the water quality that they're drinking makes such a difference on intake, and then water intake drives forage intake, and that drives performance. So it's very seldom that I'll let them into any kind of standing water. Sometimes dry cows after we wean, I might do it, but yeah, it's very seldom I'll do that. I think Oklahoma State has done some research on fresh water versus standing water or whatever, and the performance on like stock or yearlings is, it's definitely worth doing what you can to pump the water out of the reservoir and into a trough versus letting them go and stand in it. So especially when it's hot is probably that's when I want to keep them out of there the most, because that's when they're all going to go in there and churn it all up, and the quality of the water gets really bad then. And so they can't take any baths. They gotta wait till it rains. So.
Yeah, there was studies by SDSU, a person who's no longer there, out at Cottonwood, South Dakota.
Recording in progress.
Between freshwater or rural water and dams, dugouts, and 60 pounds for a gap, and that's like, wow, that's a huge difference. We can pay for a lot of pipeline, a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely. And even just our incidence of foot rot in the cows has gone down by keeping the cattle out of there as well. So yeah, there's multiple reasons that like I said, that in that earlier picture, that ended up being a bad experience. And I think part of it is, if we had 50 cows that went in there, maybe it wouldn't be as big a deal, but you got 300 and some pairs that are using that dugout. It takes about a half an hour for it to turn ugly, as far as water quality. So, yeah, it's a lot of work sometimes, but I feel like it's one of the activities we do that really does pay off. So, well, hopefully all of our activities pay off, but that one is pretty important to me. Yeah.
Other questions? If not, thank you very much. Luke, do you have contact information if you reach out to?
Yeah, I guess I didn't put that on there, but rockhillsranch.com is our website, and rockhillsranch@gmail.com is my email address. So, yeah, happy to answer any questions, and I can just stay on for a couple more minutes here or whatever if somebody's got something else. But yeah, I'm not afraid to answer questions if somebody's got something that came up after the session.
Good. All right, so I'll leave the computer up if anyone wants to come over and visit with Luke. Otherwise, we'll wrap up our session. Thank you very much.